Thank you for coming to listen to Mary Zerkel talk about the work of the American Friends Service Committee. This event is sponsored by Ann Stromquist and me, Ann Zerkel. We're residents of Oak Knoll East, so we welcome all of you. I see folks from Maine Oak Knoll, so especially welcome you. Mary Zerkel is my niece, I'm happy to say. Ann Stromquist has a long-time relationship with the American Friends Service Committee, both as staff and as volunteer. Mary Zerkel is coordinator of two initiatives of the American Friends Service Committee: the Communities Against Islamophobia Initiative and Community Safety Beyond Policing. She also directs Chicago Peace Building, and she's worked at the American Friends Service Committee for well over 20 years. Mary is an artist. She holds an MFA from the School of Art at the Chicago Art Institute, and she is co-founder of a performance art group in Chicago, Lucky Pierre. Her husband, Ian Morris, is a novelist, and they have one daughter of college age. Please welcome Mary Zerkel.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Great. It's so great to see you all this evening. I really appreciate everybody coming out here, and thank you so much to Ann and the Anns for inviting me. It was so exciting to receive this invitation. So I'm here to just tell you a little bit. I know some folks are very familiar. Who feels like they're very familiar with American Friends Service? I just want to see. Yeah, so about half and half. So after having a lovely dinner this evening with two couples who met while they were working with AFSC, I know that there's some deep knowledge in the room, so I'm going to do a little bit of history tonight, but I invite anybody to correct me or to add to the knowledge. I like to have like a learning space where we can all contribute. But yeah, as Ann said, I'm an artist and an organizer. I have lived in and worked in the city of Chicago for 32 years. And 27 of those years have been at AFSC. And AFSC is such a multifaceted organization. In my many years of working there, I've been able to travel the world, but also do work that's really rooted in my community in Chicago. Oh, thank you. Oh, technical difficulties. There we go. Thank you. So we're international. So I've been able to travel the world as part of international social movements, but also be really rooted in my community. And I've been able to use art as an organizing tool, but also be part of really down and dirty mutual aid efforts where we're really giving people material goods that they need. So I think that's one of the things. It's one of the many things that's very special about AFSC. For those of you who may not know, AFSC is over 100 years old, and there's so much to be proud of. So I'm going to try to do a little presentation, and I want to thank two women in AFSC that did some of the bones of this presentation that I then built upon, Melissa Stoner and Sharon Goins-Bradley, who's my regional director, and Melissa works in our development department, and they put together this cool presentation that I built on that kind of relates our 104-year-old history to the current work that we do today. So I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. You can see the common thread between our history and our current work. So you might be wondering, how do we do all the work that we do? And one of the things that is a cornerstone of a lot of the work that we do is that it takes courage. We're really trying to be courageous voices for social justice. So a quick note about how AFSC started. AFSC was founded on Haverford College's campus in 1917, which is the beginning of the World War I. And it was a way for young people of conscience to serve humanity without being part of the military. AFSC is committed and has always been committed to bold truth-telling and putting Quaker values into action. And in fact, you may have heard the term "speak truth to power." That is a term that emerged through our famous anti-militarism book that was published during the height of the Cold War. Courageous truth-telling, when demonstrated, is contagious, and that's one of the things that we like to think about as well. Time and time again, we've been found in spaces that others choose not to go because the work is too controversial or because it's hard. After the end of the First World War, during the armistice, we engaged in controversial efforts to feed malnourished and disease-stricken German children. Our relief work at that, Quaker relief work at that time, recognized that children, regardless of who their parents are often most impacted by things such as wars. And so we choose, again, to go to places that are controversial and are maybe not paid as much attention to in our work today. And one of the things that we do is we use humanitarian engagement to find common ground and help North Korean farmers raise farm productivity and improve food security in North Korea. So those kinds of projects, people are like, what are you doing in North Korea? But we know that in this common humanity of helping people, again, have the things that they need to have a thriving life, that's a way to build peace as well. Let's say a little bit more. Another thing that after our organization's founding, we realized that our mission extended beyond its concerns for casualties of war to combating injustice in the U.S., globally, and in the U.S. In the 1920s, AFSC hired Crystal Bird, who was a young African-American woman, to travel the country and speak about the problems and the needs and the culture of African-American folks. And the first effort to bridge the racial divide was followed by decades of work to combat lynching, expand employment and housing opportunities, and integrate public schools. Impressed by the nonviolent civil rights leadership of Dr. King, AFSC became one of his early supporters, and we published 50,000 copies of King's letter from Birmingham City Jail, which confronted the failure of faith groups to stand up for racial equality, and we arranged for Martin Luther King to also make a trip to India. So we've had this deep engagement with the civil rights era. And that's also reflected in some of the work that we do. I'll highlight particularly some of the work we do in the Midwest. We have two programs, one in St. Louis and one in the Twin Cities, that work with young people. They're part of our Healing Justice Network. And these programs work with young people to disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline through anti-racist education, organizing, and restorative and healing practices. And as you can imagine, I mean, as we all know, this year with the COVID pandemic and then the uprisings of the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, these topics were on the minds of many people in our communities. And both in St. Louis and obviously in the Twin Cities, young people were very involved in these things. And the tremendous impact left these young people very traumatized in both places. And so both of these programs in the Twin Cities and in St. Louis focus on healing practices with young people who've been impacted by violence, by the police, both police violence and violence in other ways in their communities. St. Louis recently organized an art showcase and will be having a virtual card writing party for young people in detention. And in the Twin Cities, recent work has been focused on bringing young people together for anti-racist education and know your rights, arts, painting, walking in nature, and other sort of Zoom check-ins. Here's some images from that work. Another sort of historical piece of work that AFSC has done is we've had a long history of engagement in divestment campaigns and in responsible investment actions for peace and civil rights issues worldwide, including corporate accountability campaigns and the anti-apartheid movement, farm workers' rights campaigns, and movement for nuclear disarmament, peace and anti-militarism campaigns, struggles against mass incarceration, and for the rights of immigrants. And divestment, as we know, can be a very powerful tool for social change, if you think about apartheid. And we were part of that movement with Bill Sutherland, who we spoke about at dinner earlier this evening. He was a veteran Africa activist, and he connected AFSC with liberation movements to help inform our U.S. work on South Africa. And in that work, we focused primarily on how the U.S. government and businesses movements were supporting South Africa, and we called for sanctions and divestment to force an end to apartheid. Then we provided tools for college students, faith communities, and others to pressure their institutions to divest from South Africa. And as part of this divestment strategy, our Atlanta office led a successful nationwide boycott of the Coca-Cola Company in the 1980s. And so we've carried on that history. We have an economic activism program in AFSC that does research so that people can make their investments, and you can look up, it's called Investigate. You can find it on the AFSC website, but you can look at your investments and you search our tool to see if your investments are involved with any of the projects that maybe you want to avoid, or some of the issues that you want to avoid, both environmental, with Israel-Palestine, other issues as well. And our current day program in Chicago, which is the Palestine Activism program, is connected to this work. And actually, AFSC has a really long history of work in the Middle East. We started in 1948 when the Arab-Israeli War left nearly 250,000 Palestinian refugees stranded in Gaza. And the United Nations actually turned to AFSC to help organize relief services. Early in 1949, 20 AFSC staffers faced a sea of people and began distributing food, clothing, tents, and blankets. AFSC agreed to take this on for only a specific length of time and with complete autonomy, only if we were completely independent and autonomous, and our workers didn't even carry U.S. passports, but just Quaker passports. That's interesting. We ran 10 camps at that point, and after tackling the most urgent needs of food and shelter and sanitation, the staff turned their attention to the education for all children. And our voice was one of the first and most forceful, warning that intractable problems lay ahead for hundreds of thousands of people who were abandoned in the desert with no recourse for either returning home or making new lives elsewhere. And we've maintained our engagement in Gaza and in Palestine since 1948, and have a dynamic program that's one of the most connected from our domestic work in the AFSC to our international work. We collaborate. We have staff in Gaza and also in the U.S. that collaborate on putting pressure on the U.S. government and working with young people. They also work in a multi-faith setting with folks from all other faiths to kind of put pressure on these issues, and they do incredible work. Another issue that we've been involved in for many years is healing justice, or work around the carceral system. Since the 60s, when AFSC operated halfway houses and pretrial detention programs, or pretrial programs for people who couldn't afford bail, we have seen firsthand how the criminal justice system inflicts disproportionate harm on the poor and people of color. Over the last 25 years, AFSC has been working to end solitary confinement in prisons, and in 2019, after years of advocacy and support from AFSC, New Jersey's limited solitary confinement in jails and prisons, which is pretty amazing. Our program director there just actually reached her 50th year of working at AFSC. She's an incredible woman, and her work is just fantastic. And so they've done really deep work with friends by their side, but also with the community members to really look at conditions within prisons, but also advocating for a world where perhaps we don't even need prisons. For decades, we've advocated for alternatives to incarceration, better reintegration after prison, an end to prison privatization, more humane conditions of confinement, and ultimately the abolition of prisons. AFSC's board actually created a position in a minute in 1978 on the position of ultimately abolishing prisons. So we've been involved in this work for a long time. And as you probably know, in the U.S., we jail more than 203 million people, the vast majority of whom are Black, brown, and poor people, while doing nothing to stop harm or help survivors of violence actually heal. So this issue is still very real and important today. And in fact, 10 months into the, not 10 months, we're like 18, 19 months into the pandemic, the danger of being infected by COVID exponentially multiplied when you were in prison and unable to be safe, unable to socially distance. So AFSC has had a campaign to try to free people, especially elders, who are in prison so that they will not be at risk of contracting COVID. We have an incredible program that works on many of these issues in our Michigan office, which is in Ypsilanti. And they advocate again for conditions of confinement, better conditions of confinement. They have a focus on mothers, helping women to remain with their children, or at least be able to express breast milk, things like this that help. If you have to be in prison, that you have a better condition, that you can be connected to your family. And in addition, they support those recently released from prison and are working to end life and long-term sentences. Again, they're also working on this COVID issue, and the staff there are so incredibly dedicated, and I know how hard they've sort of taken on secondary trauma by working with people in these terrible conditions and seeing the trauma that they've been going through as well. I'm going to kind of talk about a little bit of history that informs some of the work that I work on in Chicago, and I'll talk a little bit longer about some of those things. Historically, I know, as we've kind of been mentioning, AFSC has kind of stood by its values despite the odds. And sometimes courage creates company. But not always. There's lots of stories of courageous people who found themselves isolated from their communities. But also stories of courageous people who have an unpopular position, but then they're able to bring people along with them and empower their own community. So as many of you probably know, shortly after the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government forcibly relocated more than 100,000 people of Japanese heritage from their homes along the West Coast. And they were sent to internment camps to live in dirt floor huts without privacy, adequate food, or health care. Clarence Pickett, who was then the executive secretary of AFSC, publicly declared this as a calamity, and AFSC staff began to use two strategies to help achieve the release of prisoners from these camps. First, they identified colleges and universities in the Midwest and East who would accept qualified students from the camps. And second, they found jobs and housing for working-age men who were then able to bring their families to live with them. This was not a popular stance during World War II, and it wasn't until 1988 that the U.S. government apologized to Japanese Americans. But guided by our principles, AFSC was ahead of our time and standing on the right side of history, even when it was not popular. And I can tell you that when I first started working at AFSC 27 years ago, there were many, many members of the Japanese American community in Chicago who came and volunteered with us because they remember as children being helped by AFSC, and they just have a really strong dedication to the work that we were able to do and to AFSC. And I also wanted to preface some of the work that I've done with that story, because one of the projects, and Ann mentioned it at the beginning, one of the projects that a national effort that I've been part of is the Communities Against Islamophobia project, and there's also a really strong affinity and organizing work between the Japanese American community and between Muslim folks, because the Japanese American community recognizes the criminalization and sort of vilification that Muslim folks have had over the past 5-6 years, or really post 9/11, if you want to take it that far back. But I've really seen really interesting organizing work happening between those two communities, because the Japanese American folks can see, oh, this is happening again, and we can't be silent. We have to support this other community. So the Communities Against Islamophobia project that I was part of coordinating, or am part of coordinating, started before Trump was elected. We recognized way back in 2015, if you can recall, when Syrian refugees were starting to come to this country, lots of governors in certain states were refusing to let those Syrian refugees come into the state. And so we started, some of us in AFSC who worked on peace building started to realize, we need to do something about this, because these folks are refugees from war. They deserve to be treated as such. And so we started to try to figure out what's something that we could do to really make a difference, and not just sort of in an interfaith, hey, we support you, but to try to really help community. So we talked to folks and the Muslim community, and we're told that there were two things that an ally organization such as AFSC could do that would be really helpful. One was to educate other potential allies, people who realized that the anti-Muslim, the Islamophobic sentiment was not right. They knew that kind of hate was not right, but they didn't really know how to help, because maybe they didn't know how to talk about Islam, maybe they didn't know Muslim people actually, but how can we educate potential allies to actually really be helpful to the community? And then the second thing was they felt a real sense, particularly, not that this didn't happen before, but particularly since 9/11, they felt very oppressed by government surveillance of their communities. And so we designed a project, which is, we're still doing this work of developing workshops with folks about anti-Muslim racism, Islamophobia, and then also the ways that state violence in the guise of surveillance was really limiting the political agency of these communities because they were watched so much. And so what we did is a couple of things. One thing was that we did this training with well over 2,000 people, I'd say in 4 different states. And we kept our training very targeted toward people who might be able to help us do the organizing work against the surveillance. And so in Chicago, what we were doing was training teachers and social workers, because government surveillance programs, they're called the Countering Violent Extremism Program, and what those programs do is they entrust people in the community to do the surveillance. So they were working with teachers, in some cases librarians, definitely social workers, to identify young people, children basically, teenagers who might be vulnerable to radicalism, using really kind of sketchy indicators like do they have a distrust of Western foreign policy? Are they wearing outwardly religious garb? Things like this, where it's I'm guilty of both of those things, at times. But so what we did is we trained those folks, and then those folks were able to then inform other people about, surveillance is hidden necessarily, right? So, and the more that the word got out, we published a report in Chicago, and we were actually able to shut down a statewide program that was engaged in this work through a big grant from the Department of Homeland Security. So that was a success. But, these programs, it's a lot of work. These programs continue on, and we're working with people nationwide on trying to look at those things. But the other thing is that during the Trump era, harassment of the Muslim community was, as you probably all know, was really happening a lot. And so that's going to pop back up. Okay. So another thing that we did is we developed a training on bystander intervention that I think somebody was mentioning to me, and maybe, or Callie was mentioning, Lucy Duncan was doing some training on bystander intervention. Lucy Duncan is our Friends Relations person in Philadelphia, and she and I and many other people did this training to help communities understand, if you do see somebody, there were many people who were being harassed in the last several years. It wasn't only Muslim folks, but if you do see somebody who needs help or who's being harassed by somebody on the street, how you can be an effective person to disrupt that and help that person. So that training has been, again, those resources have traveled the world. It's incredible the number of folks who use those resources. And unfortunately, we found that they were useful again in this recent spate of anti-Asian hate that was happening around the COVID pandemic. So those kinds of tools, that's something that AFSC does a lot, kind of public education. And those projects, again, this work wasn't necessarily popular. We received, so I have to say, the work with Muslim communities, I really see where they're coming from, the surveillance, because I've never been involved in a project that had so many experiences of harassment, verbal abuse, sometimes physical harassment, people coming in to disrupt trainings and those kinds of things. So this work can be hard sometimes. Another project that is at the national level that I work on is called Community Safety Beyond Policing. And this is something I'm excited about. When I tell you about my local work in a minute, I'll say that we've been involved in issues in Chicago looking at police spending for many years, long before the big movement that erupted over the summer after the murder of George Floyd. But when that uprising did happen, we saw, hey, there's lots of people who are really interested in this conversation of racial justice and policing. So let's figure out a way to get people together. It was not a time of in-person meetings, so it was a moment to jump into webinars, as many people did. But we started to convene monthly community conversations on lots of different topics around policing. So we would, this is the beauty of AFSC, we have staff across the country, so we were able to bring in people who are organizing, say, on trying to remove police officers from schools, and we could have them sharing about the campaigns they have going on in their local country, or in their local communities, but then we would always break up and do small group chats with people from around the country. People were just there to learn, to hear, what do you think about this issue in your community? What's going on? Are you having organizing? Do you feel like this is an issue that's a problem in your community? So we've had a bunch of those. We've talked about alternatives to 911. We've talked about stopping police militarization. We just had one on the post 9/11 enhancements to policing that have happened. That includes surveillance and police militarization, but other things as well as like border militarization. We just had a big conversation about that. And so we're trying to deepen this work in the new year, and I'd love to share information with anybody who's interested, but we're going to be developing 3 smaller group study cohorts of people who might be interested in getting involved in this work locally. So we're going to have one that's sort of a youth abolition group, young people who are interested in these issues, one that's sort of how to build community. It's sort of an alternatives to 911 group. It's like, how can you build community capacity to be able to help people learn different ways that they can respond to emergencies instead of calling the police. And then the third one is a restorative justice study circle. So we're going to have these study groups that'll meet for like 8 weeks or so, lots of guest speakers, lots of things to read, and then hopefully some support from AFSC as people go into their communities and try to organize around these issues. So then back to some historical overview. Another thing is just that, hey, we won the Nobel Peace Prize. That was pretty cool. But that was, it was in 1947, and it was a recognition of AFSC's work in helping people recover from wars and trying to prevent conflict. And AFSC and the British Friends were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of Quaker relief and humanitarian work everywhere, which is something that I'm very proud of. For many years, AFSC was known primarily as an anti-war or a peace organization. I think that's still a really foundational part of our identity. I was really blessed to be the coordinator of the Eyes Wide Open exhibit. We were just talking to folks at dinner tonight who recall when it came here to Iowa City. But this was a project envisioned by my former regional director, the late Michael McConnell, as a way to help people understand during the Iraq War, like, people were dying even though it was very hidden. We needed a way to recognize the toll, the human toll of the war. And I share these 2 pictures. This just kills me because I worked on the Eyes Wide Open project for so many years. That's on the left. And we developed these t-shirts that you see on the right where it says, "War is costly, peace is priceless." That was a big symbol of that era. And recently, just like 2 weeks ago actually, in Chicago, we did a little training with the new generation of anti-war activists who are all high school students at Sullivan High School in Chicago. And we trained them how to canvas about Boeing, which everybody thinks of as like, yeah, I get on a Boeing jet and I'm going to go visit my aunt, in Iowa. But Boeing is actually also a weapons manufacturer. And Boeing is headquartered in Chicago and does not pay taxes, or doesn't pay many taxes. And so my tax dollars are basically going to this multi-million-dollar corporation that's building weapons that are being used in a lot of our air wars that the U.S. is involved with across the world. So these young people were super into learning this stuff, and they went and canvassed our neighborhood. And then we came back and we were like, "Hey, do you want a vintage anti-war t-shirt?" And they were so excited. So this just, I feel like we really are still doing peace work in AFSC, and I think we've just re-envisioned that in some ways. And so that's what I'm going to share with you a little bit now. So,
Mary,
yeah.
the photo on the left,
Mhm.
some folks may not realize that those are shoes.
Oh, yes. Yeah, okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so this project, I shouldn't act like everybody knows what it is. It was a project that was trying to represent the U.S. military casualties of the Iraq and later Afghanistan wars, and so those were pairs of military boots that were representing those casualties, but we also represented the Iraqi and Afghan civilian casualties as well with shoes that we just would get donated or at the thrift store. This project was just hugely successful and traveled across the country for probably 3 or 4 years. And then it got too big because we were having to hire, unfortunately there were so many casualties. We had 2 trucks that were driving around. By 2007, we split it up kind of like the AIDS quilt. We split it up into state-based exhibits, and we had them in 48 states. And those were run by volunteers. Many Quaker volunteers actually helped make this whole project happen. Some of the boots were actual boots of people who had been killed that were donated by their families. People left memorabilia. It was a big site of mourning for people of all political persuasions because there were very few spaces for public mourning during that period. So, but after the great economic collapse and all of the things that have happened in the years since, war has become very normalized. We recently got out of Afghanistan, but we're still bombing several countries, and so that's part of what my mission has been. As I've done this work for so long, I started to recognize during the Obama presidency that we really needed to think of some new ways to reach younger people and to reach a more diverse group of people, and that a lot of these communities were experiencing militarism in their communities through some of these 9/11 enhancements, like the program, the 1033 program that allows surplus military equipment to be sold very cheaply to various municipalities for their police departments, so that people in our local communities are facing, armored vehicles, stingrays, all these different drones, different sort of militarized policing equipment. But anyway, so this is how I've shifted my partner Debbie Southbourne and I work on this program together, and we've gradually shifted our work to focus on a couple of different things, which I'll share with you now. One is this idea of divesting from policing and investing in communities. We've worked on this probably since 2012. Well, 2012 was the NATO summit in Chicago, which was a big deal. We were part of that as well, but we started to shift our work toward looking at policing in that time period as well. And Chicago was a really stark example of this. We did some analysis, and I don't know if those of you who have been around AFSC know that for many years we put an analysis together of the U.S. discretionary budget and how much money went to military spending, and then all the other categories. And it was always hovered around 50%, maybe a little bit more. Environment, blah, 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 these little pots of money. Well, we did the same thing in Chicago and did that analysis of our discretionary budget and realized that our police, at the latest numbers we crunched, are getting $4.8 million per day for policing in Chicago. And that does not include the $500 million that we have paid in police misconduct settlements. And that's while we have the largest mass closing of public schools in the country. 54 public schools have closed. And that was all within an 18-month period. We also closed 6 mental health clinics. And there's so many other community needs, like as Ruth Peoples and Gilmore calls it, there's organized abandonment of communities across Chicago and the south and west sides. So it's just very, very stark that there are a lot of things that keep people safe, and having well-resourced schools and job opportunities and food that you don't have to go get on a bus and go a couple miles away to get healthy food. There's so many other things that also help keep communities safe. And so we started to work on this issue of police spending many years ago. Our most recent experience that was very successful was the No Cop Academy campaign, which really galvanized the city in our last mayoral election. We realized that our mayor, the previous mayor, started this idea of, even though there was robust work questioning these budget priorities for a while, he decided to fund a $9.5 million police academy, a new police school. While these public schools for young people were not getting, didn't have librarians, didn't have counselors, didn't have libraries in many cases, online art classes, all this stuff, but he's going to put this huge, put all this investment into a Cop Academy. So the No Cop Academy was it was a youth-led, adult-supported campaign led by youth of color, and they just brought it, and it was incredible, the support that we received. We had over 100 community organizations came together, and it really was the litmus test of our last mayoral election. Every single mayoral candidate was asked, where do you stand on the Cop Academy? Unfortunately, they're still going to build it. We did not win, and we now have a mayor, Lori Lightfoot, who is really supportive of the police on many issues, although she's getting it now because she's trying to force the vaccine issue. But we have young people who are so energized and excited on these issues, and so we are still working. The other thing that we work on is youth incarceration. And so we're part of the Final Five campaign in Illinois, which is trying to get rid of the last 5 youth prisons that still exist. We don't think any children should be incarcerated. And so we're going to switch to show you a couple other photos. This is some of our work on youth incarceration. So we're trying to, there's I think around 100 youth that are in these 5 facilities, and we feel like there's a better way that youth don't deserve to be in prison. There's all kinds of things we can do to help them thrive and to be part of society and to learn and to grow and to contribute to our communities. This is from we've done a couple of different actions outside various youth prisons. This is a couple of different ones outside the juvenile temporary detention center in Chicago, and you can see the young people. We're just usually playing music and trying to do some kind of visual thing for the young people inside. You can see there's some of them responding and feeling like, oh, somebody actually really does care. I'm stuck here. Again, during COVID, this was really scary. A lot of kids got sick. Another project that we do in collaboration with the Liberation Library is that we've just started this year producing a newsletter written by incarcerated young people for incarcerated young people. And we've just finished our 3rd issue, and it's being distributed to the young people inside. And then also we're getting interest from young people who are on the outside too, who want to get involved in writing to other young folks, and older folks are wanting to writing to young folks too. So it's a good way to educate people on these issues. But we're really looking forward in the new year to working again with Quaker volunteers and other folks who want to help us canvas around the state, because a lot of these prisons are outside of Chicago or in the more rural areas, so that'll be an interesting experience to go to talk to some folks in these communities and see how they feel about it. Wait, my slides are stuck. Okay, this is what I want to show you. The last piece of work is, we do a lot of mutual aid work since the pandemic hit, and mutual aid work is work either distributing food or other supplies that people need, not as an act of charity, but really in solidarity with communities and making it part of base building and political work. And so we do that. We had a generous private donation of $10,000 during the pandemic, and we were able to distribute that on the south and west sides. We bought Chromebooks for young people, distributed food and supplies, and involved those young people then in the work to be talking about hey, what are our budget priorities in Chicago? How come our mayor actually gave a lot of our COVID CARES Act money to overtime for the police instead of making sure that young people in public schools had a computer to work on when they had to do school from online at home, But the other thing we do is we're part of a community where both Becky and I live. Is a very diverse community on the north side of Chicago, and we're involved in mutual aid work there. We are part of the Rogers Park Free Store, which distributes probably like twice a week. We probably distribute $2,000 or $3,000 worth of household supplies that people just don't have money to, diapers, formula, cleaning supplies, those kinds of things. But the other thing that I've been involved with the free store is that I'm the sort of safety coordinator, and so I've developed a safety training that all the volunteers have to take so that we, as people doing work in the community, have the skills and the tools and protocols in place so that if an emergency happens, we can look to other things rather than calling the police on people who are already criminalized in our communities, who are using these free store services. If we can avoid calling the police for something, like if a person is having a mental health crisis, for instance, and so we help people build those skills and understand certain protocols. We have like an emergency tree, an emergency team within the free store community. We have various community hotlines that partner with us. And we build that knowledge. And then we're going to be launching in the spring a whole big training series with a bunch of other mutual aid hubs across the city to deepen people's skills so that we know how to respond to the mental health crisis, so that we know how to de-escalate, so that we know how to administer Narcan if there's kind of a drug overdose situation, and those kinds of things. And I think the other thing that's exciting about mutual aid is that it builds new social networks. I know so many more neighbors since the beginning of the pandemic than I did through this work, because we're all working together to make sure that our neighbors have what they need. And so we get to meet those neighbors, we meet the people working on the project. And so now it's like, if I see somebody on the street who might be in crisis, I might know that person through this work, and I feel a little bit more comfortable to go up to them and be like, hey, what's going on? Can I help you? And a great example of this is we have the Free Store, our other sister organization is the P.O. Box Collective, which is an art space. And outside we had a big art festival in the neighborhood, and in the span of a couple hours we had somebody overdose, and we were able to go inside the P.O. Box, and we had Narcan, administer Narcan. The person was revived, and then we were able to call medical emergency for them, and they were taken care of. And then about an hour later, a fight broke out, and it was two guys, they bumped into each other. It was a big, fight, and not only were they, I don't know what they were going to do, it was like fisticuffs, but all these people around in the festival pulled out their phones like they were going to call the police because this fight was going on. Folks, again, who are part of this mutual aid community were able to both de-escalate the fight, get the fight stopped, and get everybody to put away their phones because everything was okay, So it's like we need to develop this muscle within our community because we've been taught that, if there's music that's loud next door, I'm going to call the police instead of going over and talk to me. It's sort of like we need to build this social muscle and these skills with each other. So that's another piece of work that we're doing. And then the other piece is that we do a lot of cultural organizing. So another thing we have done over the last year is every other week gotten together and as neighbors just painting banners for whatever movement needs were emerged. So we did stuff for the people fighting ICE. We did stuff for the warehouse workers movement. It was just like whatever for many of the racial justice things that happened that summer. So people could just come to us, and painting together is a great activity. It's a great way to meet your neighbors. And we also maintain a memorial for people who've been murdered by the police across the country. In Chicago, unfortunately, this spring we had 3 young people ages 13 to 22 within the span of 10 days who were killed by the Chicago police. So we had a big memorial, community memorial for those young folks. And so those are some of the ways that culture is very important, I think, in building community. So yeah, AFSC is not just Chicago, even though that's what I like to talk about the most. But we are in 16 countries, and we have 26 offices in 26 U.S. cities. More and more, we're getting to meet and connect with our international colleagues. I'm so blessed. We learned so much from the folks we have in many countries in Africa. We've got folks in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Asia, and it's really incredible. And our vision for the future, we have a new strategic plan, which is a 10-year strategic plan. And there's lots of things inside it, but I can tell you that the sort of 3 themes that have emerged that we're trying to organize our work around are sustainable peace, and sort of our work around mass incarceration, a lot of the stuff that I was talking about. Every program in the Midwest actually is part of the sustainable peace goal, but we also have just migration. As you can imagine, we do a lot of immigration across, work on immigration across the U.S. And then the third bucket is just economies. And we see those things are not separate, they're all interconnected, you know, but just thematically, those are the things that we're going to be focused on the most, with an emphasis on climate justice where we can, on gender equality, and on racial equity as well. So, I just want to thank you all for spending some time with me. I hope we can chat if anybody has questions, but I did want to leave you with our website, AFSC.org. There's a lot of information in there. We have a cool little thing called Weekend Reading. And if you go to our homepage and look under Get Involved, you can subscribe to Weekend Reading. And every week, on Saturdays, I think it's like usually a compendium of either stories in the media about our work or blog posts. We have a lot of great bloggers on AFSC. So you can just hear about the various issues that are going on and ways to take action. And then I just left my email address too if anybody wants to get in touch. Would love to talk to you. But yeah, I would love to hear if people have any questions. Again, I know some folks in here probably know so much more about the history than I do. If there are any corrections or additions to add to that incredible history, I know people have had a lot of great experiences with AFSC. So thank you all. Oh, and I have 3 posters, so I'll do some. Any questions or thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
Where do you get your funding?
Our funding is from a variety of sources. I think one of the things that has kept AFSC viable and able to do work that is at times very unpopular or controversial is that we get most of our money through individual donations, which is fantastic, you know, and it's because people, again, we're 104 years old. Many people have engaged with AFSC at various points in their lives and are like, I trust this organization, I'm going to give to them. We do get some foundation funding as well, but that tends to be, you know, more restricted, and they'll only fund certain types of work. You know, so I think the individual donations are really a key, one of the keys to our ability to do prophetic work. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Are you involved with outbound refugees in the U.S.?
It's kind of on a case-to-case basis, and various communities, people have been supporting that. But one of the things, we did used to have a program in Afghanistan during the war years, and one of the things that we were very active with was immediately connecting with people who used to work with AFSC and working really hard to try to get them visas to get out. And so I don't know exactly the success rate of that, but I know it was something that our international programs were very involved with. But yeah, in some of our cities, people are very connected to, again, providing material aid and other ways to help welcome refugees. The other thing is that during those years, we worked very closely with Dr. Zahir Wahab, who is a professor at Lewis and Clark University, but he also was a consultant with the Afghan government in their education department, and he has a fantastic analysis. So we did a bunch of programs with him recently, right around this stuff. There's Facebook Live you can look up, and he spoke. We had a conference, an international conference called The Reckoning, that was dealing with sort of the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the War on Terror, and Dr. Wahab was a speaker at that conference as well. Yeah.
You know, the slogan, abolish the police, has become a really hot button issue for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And, you know, we saw in Minnesota, for instance, that the statewide referendum was turned down.
Yeah.
It would have converted the police into public safety.
Yeah.
How do you respond to people who see that as a threat, or who are seeing it in a one-dimensional way?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I get it. I mean, we've been raised our whole lives to look to the police department to keep us safe in many different ways, depending on your positionality. I have many of my African American coworkers who would say, "Oh no, that's not like, to me, it's the military spending thing. Why are we spending all this money on the military when there's so many needs that go unfunded in our communities, you know, at the federal budget level? It's the same thing at the local budget. And policing isn't, the money's not doled out federally very much. It's very much by location to location, which makes it complicated. But what I would say is that, like in Minneapolis, they went too fast. It's not going to happen overnight, and it shouldn't happen overnight because we have so much work to do. Because, like, and I do that. I'm coordinating these safety trainings for the Free Store, and in many cases, it's like, well, what if there's a shooting on the block? Well, honestly, there's not a great alternative. You know what I mean? There's a lot of things because we haven't developed nonviolent alternatives to many emergencies. We have a lethally armed force that arise from many issues that do not need lethally armed people. And so we're in this moment of, as my friend and somebody whose work has really inspired my own, learned so much from her, Miriam Kaba, who's written a great book I encourage you all to read. It's called We Do This Till We Free Us, and it's a great reader on police abolition. But, she's like, we're in this moment of 1 million experiments, and she even has a project called 1 million experiments, and that's really what people need to be doing now, is like working at the community level, not to say like, let's get rid of the police entirely at this particular moment, but like, what can we build up in the community that could be a way that we can respond without a lethally armed person. And I'm for pulling money. Let's not build this $95 million police academy. Let's put that money into like well-resourced schools so that young people grow up having a good education and wanting to, do all kinds of cool things. Those are the trade-offs that I think it has to be slow, and I think, but it has to be visionary too. And I think that's sort of where I'm at. It's like we have to be able to imagine a different world, but we have to be able to build it incrementally. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
So, in Iowa City, we have one of those pieces of military equipment that was donated. It was, I think you mentioned communities buy them sometimes.
Yeah.
I think ours was donated by the military, and we want to get rid of it. So have there been any successful campaigns that you can think of that were, the machine is here.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to get rid of the tank, the military tank.
Yeah, I bet.
I just wondered if you have any suggestions.
Yeah. Actually, it's really interesting, and that actually, on the, if you go to the AFSC website, Community Safety Beyond Policing, we have a landing page with all of our webinars, and we just had this webinar on police militarization and local campaigns to either limit the use of, if they couldn't physically get rid of the weapon, like at least let's have some baselines of like limiting the use and that kind of stuff. And it's really interesting. It gets very in the weeds. Our Bay Area office is really involved in this, and they've had all kinds of weird situations where they were successful in limiting the use of particular, military-grade weapons at the county level, but then the state level would pass a different law, and that would kind of overturn what they did. It's just like, it's hard. It is hard. It's like the Pandora's box, right? Once you have these things out in the world, I think they are. But that said, it's important work. And there is a guy in that webinar, I'll send you a link to this, and because there's a guy who is really one of those guys who just is dug down into the weeds on this legislation, and he's trying to help other communities to replicate some of the things that he's discovered. So I'm going to send that to you. Any other thoughts? Or thank you so much. I really enjoyed this time. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share some of this with you all.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all for coming.
Oh, I forgot what to say. I don't know, I slipped past the slide, but I just want to let you know one quick last thing. Michael McConnell, for those of you who remember him, I mentioned him earlier. We're starting a youth fellowship in Chicago in his memory, and so we're going to have a part-time Michael McConnell Peace with Justice Youth Fellow in Chicago. We'll have health benefits, and they are going to be just graduated young person who will help
I just want to say that these are lovely posters. This one was created by someone you know, right?
Yeah, Micah Bazant, I don't know if folks know,
Okay.
fantastic artist.
We all belong here. We will defend each other.
And this, Micah developed this. We commissioned it from him. We had this at right at the Trump inauguration, and just we did a whole curriculum with Micah and had it in classrooms all over the country. So please grab one.
And this one, build communities, not cages, and end detention and deportation. So these are free. Mary brought them from her office. Please come and take a look and take what you would like. And have a good night.
Thank you.